Okay, here we are again. Not quite at the end of the book, but getting quite close really, I think. Out in China. And here, of course, is a reminder of when Sarah and Mark were out somewhere near the South China Sea. I'm not sure where this was, but that's Sarah's drawing of the place where they were. Looks nice. So, you'll remember Tien Pao and Glory of the Republic have been found again on top of a tall rock by two American airmen or soldiers who have carried them from the rock and along the road until they came, it sounds as if they've come to a jeep or a car, because although Tien Pao was very tired and fell asleep while being carried, that must have been quite a nice change for him. When Tien Pao opened his eyes again, the men were taking him down a dirt road. There was a little open carriage standing at the side of the road. The soldier put Glory of the Republic down and sat down in the carriage behind a wheel. A woman was walking down the little road. The soldier, holding Tien Pao, set him down and pointed to the woman. "Mama?" he asked. "You want to go home to your mother?" he said very slowly, as if that would help Tien Pao to understand. Tien Pao half guessed what it might be the soldier was saying, and he pointed far away from the walking woman. He made believe he was shooting. He tried to make the terrible sound a cannon makes and the swift rattle of rifle fire. He pointed to the woman and spread his hands wide. He pointed to a man in a far-away rice paddy, and again he spread his hands. He waited anxiously. The two soldiers talked to each other. Tien Pao listened to the strange, fast words. His lips moved along with them. So anxious was he to have the soldiers understand. If only they would take him along and give him food, then he could go back to the rock and watch for his father and mother, not forgetting Beauty of the Republic. As if to help the soldiers understand, Tien Pao kept whispering it. "Please understand. Oh, please, please understand." Suddenly, the soldier picked him up and set him in the back seat of the carriage. He placed Glory of the Republic in Tien Pao's lap. He stepped into the high seat himself and sat down next to Tien Pao. The man behind the strange wheel did things with his hands and feet. The carriage suddenly roared and shot ahead. It hopped and jumped and bounced in swiftness over the little road. It went still faster. The wind sang through Tien Pao's hair. The rushing wind revived him a bit. The sickness sank down from his eyes, but Tien Pao clung to Glory of the Republic. Glory of the Republic seemed to think he was running as fast in this wild horseless carriage, as fast as this wild horseless carriage was rushing. He had his mouth wide open, he panted, but Tien Pao closed his eyes. In spite of the cooling wind, in spite of his hunger, he was sorry he had come. He wished the thing would stop. Then it did stop. Tien Pao opened his eyes, but with a squeal and a shriek, the mad carriage swung off the road into a narrow drive and rushed up to a compound. where stood, let's have a look, a long wooden building. It stopped again and was completely quiet. Tien Pao dared open his eyes and keep them open. There were many soldiers about the compound. There were soldiers everywhere. And they were all white. But they didn't all have golden hair like the airman. They were all white, but their hair was of many different colours. The man behind the wheel called to one of them. As he turned and came to the jeep, Tien Pao edged away from him. This man had green eyes like a cat. And he had red hair, and he was hairy all over. Hair even sprouted from his bare shoulders. He looked like a great ape to Tien Pao. The hairy, green-eyed ape looked at Tien Pao, and then he yelled something that made all the other soldiers come running to look at Tien Pao and Glory of the Republic. The loud, fast talk of the strange language flew, and everybody looked at him and seemed to talk about him. Then Tien Pao didn't know where to cast his eyes. All of a sudden, the hairy one lifted Tien Pao out of the jeep and carried him into the long house. That must be the barracks of these soldiers. Tien Pao clung to Glory of the Republic. It was a strange house, this wooden house of the Americans. It was all one long room. But the room was all bedroom. It was full of windows and full of beds, double beds, the one above the other. And even though it was still daylight, many men jumped out of the beds when Tien Pao, with Glory of the Republic, was carried into the long room. A half-naked soldier sat up in one of the beds and pointed to Glory of the Republic and shouted something. 2 soldiers ran up and tried to pull Glory of the Republic out of Tien Pao's arms. Tien Pao wouldn't let go. They pointed to the door. They wanted Glory of the Republic to stay outside. Tien Pao still wouldn't let go. But the hairy man, who had looked so horrible to Tien Pao, grinned a big understanding grin. He said something and they let Glory of the Republic be. Tien Pao loved him for that, even though he had green eyes and was red and hairy. He wished he could tell the good man what a proper pig Glory of the Republic was, and that he knew how to live in houses. Now the red-haired man set Tien Pao down and let out a shout. At that yell, a Chinese came hurrying from somewhere, and all the men from outside came into the house, and all the men came down from their bunks. They crowded around Tien Pao and the Chinese man. The man said in Chinese, "I am an interpreter. Knowing the strange language of these Americans, these men think you are lost." "I am lost," Tien Pao said gravely. "Nor do I know where my father and mother are. I've just come from behind the Japanese lines, from Hengyang." When the interpreter translated that Tien Pao had just come from behind the Japanese lines, excited questions really rained down on him from all sides. The interpreter hastily told Tien Pao to tell his whole story from the beginning, and to tell it slowly. Tien Pao looked steadily at the interpreter and began to tell of the awful trip down the river. The interpreter took the words from Tien Pao's mouth and made them American, and all the men listened intently. But when Tien Pao started to tell about the yellow-haired airman who had crashed and whom the guerrillas had saved from the Japanese, all the men became so excited they forgot that Tien Pao couldn't understand them, and they began to question Tien Pao directly. Tien Pao could only wearily shake his head. But among all the questions there was one word the men kept saying again and again. "What is this Hamsun word that the men keep saying?" Tien Pao asked the interpreter. "That is the name of the airman you saved," the interpreter told him. "But do these men know him? Is he here then? Is he one of them?" No, these 60 men belong to a bomb squadron. They fly the big bomber planes. Lieutenant Hamsun is flight leader of a fighter squadron. He flies a small fighter plane, and his fighter squadron is housed at the far end of this airfield, but he is now in the hospital at this field. However, all these men know him, and he told them of you." "Is he well?" Tien Pao asked hastily. "His wound is healing fast. Oh, I've no doubt these men will take you to see him tomorrow. They seem to feel like fathers to you." "They will?" Tien Pao said. "Oh, I'm glad." Oh, but this was exciting news. This was all so exciting. He wasn't even tired or hungry anymore. "Oh, I'm glad," Tien Pao said all over again. He started laughing, and then he had a hard time stopping, even though the interpreter looked at him strangely. Oh, but this was exciting. "But tell the men all you saw behind the Japanese lines. Tell them all. About Heng Yang too." Tien Pao looked at the ring of faces. White faces, but friendly faces. They were all grinning at him. All of a sudden Tien Pao felt so light and wonderful, so safe. Safe? Why, here he was safe. No one could hurt him here. Not among 60 white airmen. 60, the interpreter had said. 60, all in one long wooden room with beds and windows. It was all so safe and strange and unbelievable. Tien Pao began laughing again, with the unbelievable wonder of it. He stopped himself. He mustn't laugh. These men wanted to know all. Tell them all about Heng Yang too. Tell them about his village, and aeroplanes raining death and sampans sinking, and the 3 ducklings, the one in a river full of water trying to scramble back into his dishpan home. The flaming plane, and the airman tumbling out of it, and the Japanese shooting at him on top of the tall river cliff, and the long, scared, dark, hungry journey. Tell them all. He was talking too fast. He could hear it, he was babbling. But not about those horrible things. No, not those horrible things. About the old toothless woman who had handed him a bowl of rice, and had made a guerrilla chief wait while he, Tien Pao, ate a second bowl of steaming rice. But these men would not care about an old woman and a second bowl of rice. They couldn't even understand except through the interpreter. But Tien Pao was in such a hurry to tell them all, he couldn't wait for the interpreter. He even tried to tell it with his eyes. He could feel his eyes getting bigger and bigger. And the white faces all around him. They were friendly faces, but they were getting dark. They were swimming away. Tien Pao started yelling at the faces swimming away. But he mustn't yell. These men were his friends. He mustn't yell at them. And he mustn't start crying now. That there was that other old woman. She was mad, mad, mad. She had brought him to the train, and she had hung half in the window, half out. And the train kept backing. He had to yell. They must hear him, and he mustn't cry. He must smile. These were his friends. Tien Pao smiled, but the smile became a squealy laugh. What a silly baby laugh. Why didn't he stop? The faces were becoming black. Everything was black. Silly, silly. Tien Pao slid to the floor. Food odours stirred Tien Pao to life again. When he fluttered his eyelids open, he found himself in one of the high bunks, all undressed, and with just a sheet thrown over him. Tien Pao dazedly looked at the red-haired soldier standing beside the bunk, but then his eyes went wide. He jerked himself to a sitting position. The man was holding a big tray. The tray was full of plates and bowls, all of them heaped high with hot, steamy, lovely food. Then Pao's hand flew out to the tray. Suddenly the red-haired man stepped back out of reach. The food was out of reach. Tien Pao felt himself going weak all over. He didn't try to reach the tray again. He just let himself fall back in the bed. He started crying. The fierce emptiness burning within him, and the heavenly smell of hot food heaped on the tray. He couldn't help it. He had to cry. He cried. He did not try to understand why the man had done that to him. The soldier stood there looking desperately at Tien Pao. And Tien Pao just wanted to cry and to hate him more and more, the big green-eyed hairy ape. The man began yelling, and he sounded fierce, and he must be yelling orders, for men went running out of the room, out of the doors at both ends. At last one of them came back with the interpreter. The hairy ape stood there with the tray, talking long and earnestly to the interpreter over the heaped tray. The interpreter turned to the bed. Master Sergeant Wilson, who is the chief of all these men, wants you to know that he fully intended to give you all the food, but when you awoke so suddenly, just that moment he'd begun to think that maybe it would do you much harm, all this food, after so little. That is why he stepped back, but he has sent a man after the military doctor. The doctor will soon be here, and he will know. I understand, Tien Pao said wearily. He tried to look and smile at the hairy one, who was the master sergeant of all these men, and who was called Sergeant Wilson, and who was a good man. But he couldn't help it. His eyes went only to the food on the tray. A last wrenching sob hiccuped out of him, but even so, it was almost sweet relief not to hate the good man so hard any more. Glory of the Republic must have been under the bunk, for now, grunting and snuffling, he barged right into the tray with dishes and bowls. Dishes rattled. Glory of the Republic chewed and smacked. Tien Pao leant over the edge of the high bunk and watched. In spite of himself, he began crying with greed and jealousy. Never had anything been too much for his little pig, but now he was jealous of the pig. A big murderous hate and rage stormed up in him. He threw himself back hard on the bed so he couldn't see it and stared stonily up at the ceiling. The long room went very quiet. All of a sudden, all the men seemed to have nothing to say to each other, and nothing to do but look at him. No, they sat on the edges of their bunks watching the floor, waiting for the doctor to come. The door opened. A new man came in. He must be an officer, for all the men jumped off their bunks and stood stiff and straight. At a word from the man, who must be the officer doctor, they all came to gather around Tien Pao's bunk. They stood back, but the doctor stooped over Tien Pao, and Sergeant Wilson and the interpreter stepped up to stand beside him. The doctor pulled the sheet back, and Tien Pao lay naked before him and all the men. The doctor looked him all over, and peered down his throat, and pulled back his eyelids, and grunted busy questions to the interpreter as he worked. The interpreter asked, "The doctor wants to know what have you been eating?" Before Tien Pao could answer, a searing needle was run into his arm. Tien Pao winced, but even while he winced, the pain was already gone. There was an odd, thick feeling in his arm that seemed to steal all over him. Tien Pao kept a wary eye on the doctor while he told the interpreter, "I had 4 bowls of rice, but mostly I ate leaves. I didn't like grass." The interpreter translated what Tien Pao had said. All the men made noises in their throats. But the doctor just grunted disgustedly and turned Tien Pao over. Then the doctor really made busy grunts, and he called all the men around and pointed to Tien Pao's bruises. He talked to the men. Somebody laughed a queer short laugh. The doctor asked. The interpreter hastily explained to Tien Pao. "What did you do, jump off a few mountains?" Tien Pao laughed. "I all but did, that day when the Japanese shot down the plane of Lieutenant Hamsun, for they shot at me too, and I guess I tried to run faster than the bullets, and I fell down that steep river cliff." The interpreter did not translate, for the doctor was talking to the men, and while he talked he kept gently rubbing Tien Pao's swollen stomach. The doctor sounded angry. At last the doctor pulled the sheet back over Tien Pao. He turned to Sergeant Wilson, and he must be giving orders and instructions, for the chief sergeant nodded his head, and the interpreter nodded right along with him. Then the doctor gave Tien Pao a quick pat on the cheek and turned and strode from the room. Immediately the whole room became busy. It almost seemed as if all the 60 airmen were suddenly rushing here, there and everywhere, doing busy things for him. It made Tien Pao feel warm and good. Surely the interpreter had been right when he'd said these men would be as 60 fathers to him. They acted just like fathers. The doctor had hardly closed the door when the first man came trotting back from wherever he had gone, and now he handed a new tray to the chief sergeant, who had not moved from the side of the bed. On the tray lay one miserable thin slice of toasted bread. The man held one little glass of warm milk in his hand. He ordered Tien Pao, through the interpreter, to take tiny, slow sips, and Master Sergeant Wilson stood by and watched like a hawk to see that Tien Pao did just that. But Sergeant Wilson himself fed Tien Pao the slice of toast, a crumb at a time. He broke it into such tiny crumbs, he acted as if he were feeding a chicken. As if Tien Pao's arms were suddenly paralysed and he couldn't feed himself. But it felt nice to be babied. It almost made Tien Pao a little moist around the eyes. While the sergeant fed him crumb by crumb, 2 soldiers were standing by with a pail of warm water and sponges, The moment Tien Pao finished the crumbs, they began bathing him, but they dabbed and pecked with such clumsy gentleness at the old wounds and bruises, most of the water dripped onto the bed. Soaked as the bed got, the bath was soothing. It brought a wonderful, sleepy, cosy feeling to all of Tien Pao's tired, aching body. The men turned him over to bathe his back, over the edge of the bunk. Tien Pao could see the tip of Glory of the Republic's snout. Glory of the Republic was sound asleep. The little pig's chin rested in the tray among the empty dishes. Tien Pao fell asleep, looking at the sleeping Glory of the Republic. And that is where we're going to stop, because we've now just got to the last chapter. So we'll say goodbye to Tien Pao and Glory of the Republic until the next session.